to our lecture series. I'm delighted tonight to have David Urban here speaking about his art in conversation with gallery director Sara Knelman. Thank you both for being here. Thank you. Sara, take it away.
Indeed. So, David, the occasion, of course, for this event is this new body of work which we are surrounded by here today. And I want to get to that, but before we get to speaking about this new work and what brought you here, I thought we might start at the beginning, as it were. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about your trajectory into the world of being an artist. You've made a choice to be with art in your life, and really to be with painting. Although I know, of course, you're engaged in many other kinds of arts, literature, music, design, architecture, in different kinds of ways. So I wanted to ask how you came to be with art. That's really the question.
Well, I guess it all started when I was a kid, like it did for many artists. Just feeling very happy with pencils and crayons and paintbrushes in my hand. And I guess moreover feeling a sense of selfhood and freedom that was absent from other parts of my life, because I feel like I was quite a shy child, and that when I was in the world of visual imagination, I was very much at home and felt a sense of confidence that maybe I didn't have in other aspects. And then as I got older, I became interested in creative writing and literature, poetry. But always at the back of everything I always did, I was usually working on painting. So when I went to York University in the 80s, I majored in English literature.
Indeed.
And thought it was great, but my wife, Gina, we were just dating at the time. She said to me that she had taken a fine arts course and it was the best thing in the world. And I thought, wow, I didn't really think I'd be capable of, doing university fine arts. But she said, no, we have to, try this, because she had great success at it. And I did, and then all of a sudden I just felt like, oh, okay, I'm really at home now. I'm really happy to be in this environment where.
So it was at York when you sort of really found your home with painting particularly.
I would say so, yeah. And then when I finished up at York, I was confident enough that I wanted to go to graduate school, but had a hard time getting into graduate schools with painting, because in many ways I was doing what I am doing right now, but that kind of painting was not really, the approved mode. So I wound up doing a little detour into creative writing poetry. But again, the more I wrote poetry, the more I started writing about paintings and images from paintings. And of course, I always had either a studio in the garage, in the basement, even in the kitchen, wherever I was able to paint. I always continued that.
I know your engagement with other arts has been a source of inspiration for you, and I know you've been invited to other institutions to speak about other arts as well, including the AGO. But it's interesting to hear you talk in relation to your own work about being kind of out of fashion or out of step with what the work that was being done at the time. I'm curious if you can speak about who you were looking to for inspiration in that moment when you were thinking about carrying on particular traditions in painting.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, I hope that the artists that I really love are present in this exhibition or in my efforts in general.
Such as?
Well, I love Cézanne, I love Matisse, I love, in many ways I have to single out Philip Guston as being the kind of, most powerful revelatory figure in my work, because I remember looking at his earlier paintings, which I admired, and thinking he's just such a beautiful touch and way with color, and not being able to reconcile that with these incredible, imaginative, almost, they seem like they were out of the blue in the early 70s, that turned to figuration. And I wondered, how could this person make this incredible leap? I don't see it that way anymore. I see more or less a profound continuity in his work. But at the time, I was just blown away by this this leap that he made into a new place. And around the same time, I was looking a lot at Clifford Still, and I had a similar thing where I'd gone to the Albright Knox Museum many times and seen that room of Clifford Still paintings, and was always impressed by them. But then at a certain point, like with Guston, it just clicked. And I think what happened is I went from being, kind of a passive recipient of the painting, understanding something about the soul of the people who made them, or the real feelings that are implicit in the paintings. And this can happen, as an art viewer. You can have these kind of interactions on a casual level. Maybe they come to you all at once. Some paintings, I think a lot of people, perhaps with Rothko, I find they have a very visceral and direct experience, and they love that artist right away. Whereas for me, Guston and Still, and to a lesser extent Charles Birchfield, these are artists that it took me a long time to understand them.
Yes.
And then when I did, their meaningfulness is almost it's impossible to overstate it. They're just like, lights in the dark. They're just incredible.
Would you add a sort of Canadian tradition to those inspirations as well?
I would say that overall, outside of Bourdois and Montreal School, the post-painterly guys as well, like the ones that went from abstract expressionist kind of ideas into more plastic and refined color combinations. Like I love Molinari, but Bourdois, Riopel, that whole group of painters, group of seven I always admired, but they never really hit me the way that Van Gogh hit me, or other painters that engaged in landscape. But it's so much a part of how you grow up here. You take a trip to the McMichael and you see these paintings. So I would say they're important in the sense that they were always there as examples of people from this community that made paintings and were committed to it. And obviously that gives you the idea that you could actually be an artist in this culture.
So you spoke about being inspired by Guston, and particularly understanding a moment in his career as being a great leap. And I might think of this body of work as a great leap in your career. We're too close to it to quite see it that way yet, but it does seem a very specific expansion, or departure isn't quite the right word, because it is a continuation, but it's work that embraces a very different, vibrant palette for you, and that also takes the human figure as really central in a new way in your work. And I wonder if you can talk about this moment and what led to these works.
Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of like leaps and breakthroughs, because in the studio, what I feel is, like just incremental, passageways, things that open up, or brief, feelings of, ecstatic insight. But those can be very small things that happen within certain paintings.
Little windows.
Yeah, and I don't feel that. I don't feel that this work is in particular a giant leap away from what I was doing. Although I have to say that as I get older, I care less and less about so many things about that are related to the anxiety of art making, and I think that's just a part of aging in general. But when I paint now, I feel closer to my youthful optimism than I have for many, many years. And I think that maybe that's what people are sensing in these paintings.
I think you can feel that. Yeah. I wonder if you might say a little more specifically about what you were inspired by, or what your question was as you approached this body of work. Maybe particularly these works, which are a kind of series within the series.
There's so many things. I guess I should start by saying that fatherhood was a profound influence on the direction and shape of my work. So that when my son Joseph was born, who's 19 now, but when he was born, it was such an upheaval, both personally and artistically, that everything in my work changed. And I had an exhibition at the AGO in 2003 that basically was a documentation of that particular body of work. And it was really just because, having a toddler, I'd find myself lying on the grass and looking at the sky, looking at trees, looking at all the basic things that you sort of can take for granted in the day-to-day life. Even as an artist who's supposed to be paying intricate attention to, the daily world, you start taking things for granted. And I got a second set of eyes, and I felt like two things really. One, my work wasn't incorporating all of the art historical things that I love. In other words, I wasn't enough in dialogue with early modernist painters that I really, really admire. And the second thing, that it wasn't reflecting quite enough what my day-to-day existence was like. So after I made those changes, it wasn't something that just was static after that. It was it's something that continued to change as my son got older. So when he was in, that horrendous, awkward stage of puberty, middle school, I started feeling that palpably along with him, of course, because the empathy you have. And I thought, well, it would be great if we got into comics together, because that was something that I really loved as well. In particular, the work of Jack Kirby, who I consider to be one of the great artists of the 20th century, just even outside of what he did in comics. So immersing myself in that again, and again through a younger set of eyes, opened my work up to this idea of a figure that could be quite exaggerated, cartoonish, malleable, plastic, all kinds of things that I maybe would not have experimented in the same way, but I certainly started looking at my own work as being something that could reflect that sense of comic tragedy in some sense. I like to look at these figures as being tragic comic, Some of them are based on things like this one's based on swimming at sunset in North Ontario, and this pose is based on a deposition painting from art history. So sometimes there's an art historical reference to the poses of the figures, and sometimes they're just really funny kind of self-portraits, that may or may not fit in with that iconography.
There's a definite feeling of, I find, of the mood of the figure, especially as you look among and between the works. You can feel different tensions in the body. You can feel different moments of day and night. And was that sort of variations on a theme sort of part of what you were trying to do with this?
I love that. In fact, I look at this body of work, in particular all the horizontal paintings, which kind of hang together as a set.
Exactly.
It's like a sonnet sequence, or a group of lyric poems or something like that. That it's variations on a theme. Thinking of Wallace Stevens, maybe how to look at a blackbird. That poem, the Blue Guitar series, where you have a certain subject and you're just changing the lens or the framework as you go from one to the other. But I love the idea that, and they're meant to be these things that you empathize with and identify with the figure, and the setting becomes the setting is quite abstract, but nonetheless, because of the horizontality you see in that architecture, you see in that landscape, and you bring your own, things that resonate with you are going to be carried into the painting in that way, I hope,
Now, out of these works, or in the wake of these works, you then made some slightly larger, some very larger canvases, which are then quite different again, but have a direct relation. So in particular, in this room, we can think of this piece here, which you've titled Portrait of Tom Thompson. Bring us back to your relation to Canadian painting as well.
That's an interesting one, because now that you mention it, I did, this is the second time I've done something like that. I did a portrait of Kathleen Munt in another series of paintings about maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And then this one came up. I was thinking about Thompson because of reading something in the paper about the AGO getting rid of a bunch of A.Y. Jackson paintings because apparently they don't have room for them. And I thought this was the most absurd thing in the world. So I started thinking about what that tradition means to me as a painter. And to go back to what I said earlier, it was always the background. It was like the background noise almost of being a painter in Canada, that you were aware of that painting.
You can't not be.
But with certain paintings, with Tom Thompson in particular, and Maurice, there's this profound poetic quality. They have an incredible sensitivity to color that I've always admired and thought, wow, if I could get any of that in my paintings, it would always be a goal. And because of the color things going on in these paintings, I felt it worthy of expanding into a couple larger images. And again, it's...
the question of landscape is very interesting in this piece as well, because landscape is present very often in your work. And here, you've almost altered one of your bands to be a landscape within a landscape.
Yes,
so
exactly.
that blue band has a kind of feel of being a more traditional landscape painting, or a kind of imagined representation of that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. It's a reference to the landscape, and it's also a motif that I've used within my paintings, over the last while. The top form there, the red, is a nod to the kites that I was putting in my paintings earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then those purple bands is something new. But I felt like those are almost like they can be seen as depths that can be fallen into. And they have this very otherworldly light. And I was thinking, obviously, in this painting about, sunset emotions and colors.
Yes.
And oddly enough, it was this purple to white combination against the orange and blue that evoked these qualities for me.
They have an almost mirror-like quality.
Yes, absolutely. And I've painted these things almost obsessively, mirrors, canvases within a canvas, rectangles that are meant to be identified with as bodies. So there's always a sense of a world within a world. But I just want to talk about color a little bit now that I'm remembering it. I think it's interesting because in this case, I have done some new things with my palette. But the way that people talk about color in general is that, that's a vibrant yellow, or that's a bright pink, or a green, or whatever. But really, when we talk about color, what we're talking about is relationship. And the profound thing that happened for me over the last couple of years is insights into the relationships between colors, because that's actually what produces color. Like on its own, it's hard to define any color. Mm-hmm. In fact, in psychology experiments, you can actually change people's minds from showing them blue and green just by suggestion and things like that. So what happens in paintings is it's the proximity and the adjacencies and the overall way the colors are used within the frame that define the way that we feel the color. And you mentioned like design. I've been collecting ceramics recently.
Yes.
And looking at these objects that are often extremely powerful. They're compact but incredibly powerful. And it's because of often juxtapositions of color within a very small area.
You've been collecting a particular kind of ceramic, or a sort of period of Italian design ceramic, by and large.
Actually, it started with Japanese ceramics and bronzes, and my friend Eric Woodley got me addicted to these beautiful Japanese ceramics. And everything that I find this way there are these crazy little vortexes that you just get sucked into, because all of these are really worlds unto themselves, just like painting. It's just like once you dip your foot in it, it just goes on forever. And so that led to an interest in ceramics in general. And then I started buying these pieces that are, basically mid-century. I love Italian stuff the best, just because of the joyfulness of it, the color, the way it makes you feel. So I thought I'm going to build this wall of happiness in my house of beautiful things, that I can wake up to and go downstairs and see this. If it doesn't work, I'll just blow it up. But that's the experiment right now. And this shows a similar effort, I think, exactly. Yeah.
That feeling certainly pervades.
Yeah, that there would be something from the ensemble that creates a sense of something. It's not necessarily uplift, but it's maybe a sense of just I would call it a truthfulness of being, like the way that it feels to be in the world in an engaged and sustaining relationship with nature and people.
You've written about your ideas about painting, and one of the ideas you've written about, you've touched on it a bit in various things you've said tonight in relation to the kind of the world in your mind, in relation to the paintings that you're making, the idea of these reflections of mirrors or paintings within paintings. You've written particularly about understanding painting as both a physical material object, but also as something that lives in a sort of pure way in the imagination as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could say something about that
That's
paradox.
a great. I love that idea, and it's just a great fascination of mine. I think mostly because as a person, I tend to be very linguistically oriented. So, in other words, when I think about things, I tend to think in senses, and I'm formulating my thoughts basically in sentences and paragraphs. So when I'm thinking of an idea, I'm basically reading what I think about something.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And when you go into painting, the beauty of it is just this release from the tyranny of language. Like, there's really no connection to language. The logic in painting is intrinsic to painting itself. And I love that when you're in that world, it is a kind of a pure terrain in the sense that it doesn't directly engage with that linguistic world, only tangentially. Like, when you want to explain a painting, then you come up with words, right? But when you make a painting, everything about the painting is determined internally and in relation to art history, which is a kind of gigantic treatise on art without words. And I'm very, very seduced by that idea. It's a form of relief, I think.
For you, it's a form of relief.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I came across a great piece recently about the painter David Park, and his daughter said that he had all these exclusively visual ways of looking at the world that didn't necessarily make sense, but of course made complete sense to him as an artist. So, for example, he said that there were three kinds of people. You were either a horse, or a bird, or a peach. And she said, and he never bothered to explain this. It was just the way it is, right? And when you're painting, that kind of stuff makes so much sense, right? When you articulate it, you know, with words, it's kind of funny or strange. But in painting, those kind of things are very, very evident and a part of the whole process. You know, which I'm not afraid of that absurdity. I think that's an important thing to emphasize. Like the sense of contradiction in my paintings is natural because it's how I feel about painting in general.
Yes.
Like, I've never been drawn to what other people have called like the otherness of abstraction, or the way that it's separate from the world. I've always felt that it's a hybrid activity, that it's a fantasy that any kind of painting is disconnected from history or nature, right? So I love the way all kinds of different visual systems can collide in a painting. Mm-hmm. And if you use those systems with sensitivity, then you can make a kind of sense out of it at the same time as well.
Of course. And so in some ways, all of these, even though they're not all directly, they are all self-portraits.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, but they're your self-portrait.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not necessarily your self-portraits.
Yeah,
you sort of give them out to the world to be...
And again, it's like the last thing I'm interested in as an artist is myself when I'm painting.
Yes,
what I want
to
feel is a part of this giant generative thing that we call art. And when you feel that as you're working, it's not a sustained sensation normally, but it's absolutely what you strive for. And again, it's beautiful because you're learning something as you move through an image. You're going beyond your own instinct.
I mean, it's very beautiful, and we are very lucky to be able to receive these works and to enjoy them, and that sort of transformation in a way from your mind, from your studio as an extension of your mind, and out into the world, into a gallery space, into the world beyond the gallery as well.
Thank you.
I thought that might actually be a good place to end our conversation, but David would be delighted to answer questions. People have specific questions about his history, his practice, this particular work. Yes, sir.
First of all, let me commend you in terms of how you express your articulation in art. And what prompted my query or question is that you talk about language being qualitatively different from when you use let's say, your instrument in terms of creating the works that we see. If you could go a little deeper and explain what you consider to be the cognitive dissonance separating that in terms of language, because on many levels language is visual because it can inspire, and on one level it can be even more sublime, but yet when you look at a work and look at the colors, and I'm looking at your objects of the body, totally akimbo, destructive, but yet in a constructive form. And so I'm curious as to what language prompted you to create what you did this evening.
Thanks, Monty. I think that's a great formulation you've come up with there. I'm not entirely sure, if I'm looking at, if we're talking about painting as a language, what kind of language is it? I would, for myself, it would be a language that is open-ended, that involves music, that involves poetry, that is sensitive to time and experience, but ultimately, is not a part of the logic that defines like English language. So I don't know if that helps, but I see it as something that's open to every kind of experience, including poetic utterance, but having its own set of rules. And it seems contradictory to talk about that in that way, in the sense that it's open-ended and yet there's rules or some kind of overarching system that's defining how you work within it. But the way that I could describe that to you is that when I make work, I'm often aiming for a maximum tension within the image. That is, that everything that's there should be meaningful and should be deliberate, and it should be both spontaneous, like a feeling of discovery, but also a sense of inevitability, so that when you look at it and you say block out one shape, that would change the meaning of the painting. And for me, the greatest artists apply a great attentive pressure to the entire surface of the painting, so that when you look at their art, you're feeling all of that compressed attention and sensitivity released as you view it. And I think artists like Cézanne and Mondrian are so widely admired for this quality, because it's almost like every little millimeter of their compositions are alive with decisions and a spark of intellectual curiosity.
You could say, maybe in terms of visual language, in terms of formal composition, or doing paintings, we say syntax, which syntax is what shares with linguistics. This in particular is your own language that you developed over many years.
Yes.
That's shared that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, you would know that, Michael, because you're building a language too. I mean, I think there's a certain school of painters that are concerned with building and extending languages, right? And then maybe there's another school that are preoccupied with issues of aesthetics or politics or identity, things like that. Those things don't really play into my work in that sense. But I remember coming across a record by the jazz saxophone player Oliver Lake back in the late 80s, and it was called Expandable Language. And that was his way of describing what he was up to. And I just loved that idea, right? I just thought, yeah, that's a great encapsulation of what I'd like to achieve in painting.
Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, you spoke about the horizontal line being a landscape and the figures and the rectangles, but could you just maybe say a little bit about, there seems to be leaves or a branch in each painting, what those might be?
Those are kind of interesting because they obviously they add in another element to the narrative, right? And in the case of that one, this one's called Precious Book. And I love this idea of like maybe falling asleep in the afternoon, having a volume clutched in your hand that's maybe fallen to the floor, and the sun's just beating down, and you're in this kind of idyllic nature. And that's the same with that one there. I called that one the poet William Wordsworth. But I also meant it as an illustration of Wordsworth's idea that nature is the guiding emblem that creates memory and subject matter in poetry. So in the case of that painting, you have a figure who's in maybe a reverie, maybe asleep, or maybe thinking state, but he's clutching a branch, and then above him is what could be described maybe as the idea of a branch, or an idealized branch, or a symbol of a branch. And that in a nutshell is the dialectic that animates poetry, or his poetry in particular, but most poetry.
Yes.
Hi. So, how do you know when to stop both a single painting and a whole series? Like, when do you know it's done, or do you feel like they're ever done, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's many ways of finding out when something is finished. Often physical exhaustion. You work on something and then you just sort of hit a wall after doing it for a month, and it could be because you're exhausted mentally, or you're just tired of dealing with the things that are part of that body of work, but they sort of deplete themselves naturally. Other times you feel like no matter what you do, it's not really finished in the ideal sense, and there are many paintings that, if I could get them back, I would change things. Usually not something drastic, but, change a little direction of a line here or there. And that's a part of it too. Often my wife tells me it's finished, and I believe her. So, that there's all these different ways of determining whether something's done. But I suppose ultimately, I feel like every painting is a stab at something that could be answered in the next painting. So there's a kind of just logical progression to say, okay, I tried it this way, next. And that's how I do it.
And what about the second part of that question? Do you think of your work as different moments, or groups of work as different distinct moments? Do you sort of know when one ends and the next begins?
No, that's because my nose is right in it.
Yeah.
It's very hard to have any kind of genuine perspective. Maybe like over a decade, I'll see something that I did 10 years ago, and it strikes me as very much like looking at a photo of yourself from 10 years ago. You become instantly aware of how you've changed.
Yes.
But on day to day, of course, you don't perceive it at all.
Was there a question there? Yes.
Yeah, just on that idea, like, are they all open at once, or do you close them and then move on?
They're generally, it's generally a one at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then as the studio fills up, I'll tweak them all and then hopefully get them to a point where they're all ready for exhibition. But they're more or less of single formulations. Each one has its different set of ideas or problems.
What did you close last in the show?
This was the last painting, and it doesn't mean an end to the smaller ones, but it certainly means that I'm ready to do some larger ones, and I just felt that need to change the scale.
Any other last thoughts or questions? Yes.
This is the second time I've seen the work, and I keep looking at the triangle or the rectangles, and they're very crisp. It's almost as if, to me, I know maybe you've talked about this already, that you've cut them surgically and peeled away the upper layer to reveal what I'm seeing in the colors. From here, I mean, when I see from here, it's not as prevalent.
Right.
When I look at those paintings from here,
Yeah.
it looks like you peeled away and revealed something to me that was underneath the orange.
Yeah.
Was that an intent, or is that just something a technique that you're just trying to try out?
That goes back to what I was saying about trying to get the colors to operate so that there's a forward and backward
Yeah.
motion in them.
Yeah.
And it just has to do with getting the contrast or the hues in this kind of relationship that's productive. And different people will see things, because we all have different apprehension of color to a degree. So some people will see things popping forward, other people will see the receding more. But I do like to get that play that's, it kind of startles you because you don't exactly know what's going on, because the colors are,
They seem to take a different perspective from where you're standing.
yeah,
I could be standing here and
Exactly.
this way, and standing here, it's completely different.
Yeah.
It didn't dawn on me until I saw it the second
yeah,
time.
that's true.
Say thank you, David, for
Thank you.
sharing your thoughts with us, and very happy to continue the conversation more informally over a glass of wine. If everyone would join us, that would be great. Thank you
Thank
again.
you.